I think that what we need to figure out is whether or not we can maintain a kind of moral commitment to preserving the dignity of any given individual and recognizing the merit of any given individual on the one hand, and understanding that that individual merit can potentially find its way into a more sort of complete and holistic and group level understanding of what our identity is as a nation, and to merely acknowledge that it is an Anglo-Protestant country does not at all efface or erase that individual identity, as you were talking about in your own case with
Correct.
your Italian father, in my case with, I'm half Jewish on one side, Croatian on the other, like, peak Ellis Islander, but whose grandparents both fought in World War II and earned Purple Hearts, and through the sort of crucible of fighting a war on behalf of this nation. And in the midst of an immigration pause, when all of these people from these various places were forced into a kind of collective consciousness of who they were as a country, were able to become American. And now it's has to be said that process of assimilation that happened across the middle of the 20th century after, the great Ellis Island wave had long-term effects, indelible permanent effects on the nature of what the United States was. But you can still recognize a Anglo-Protestant core that everybody was orienting themselves towards in law, in custom. There's this great book by a controversial mid-century sociologist from Harvard, a guy named John Marie Cudahy, The Ordeal of Civility. Are you familiar with The Ordeal of Civility, Chris?
I am. My Jewish American friends have pointed me in this direction very quietly, and I will leave it to you to describe.
Look,
this seems like you maybe have a greater insight. Yeah.
Well, it's a wonderful book. I mean, it's really good and really insightful, and has been, I think, very unfairly maligned by a kind of universalist, egalitarian ethos, a sort of multicultural ethos, and it's pointed as a kind of example of this coercive and mean-spirited kind of assimilationist retail that was being imposed on
summarize the main thesis of the book.
Well, okay, the main thesis is that, and Cudahy is critiquing the Jewish experience in particular, and the quote unquote Ostjuden, the Jews from mostly Eastern Europe that came during the Ellis Island wave. Of course, the United States had some percentage of Jews going back to the founding, largely Western European, largely German. And they were very much opposed, by the way. There's like an interesting interfactional history there, and these big disputes, cultural and otherwise, between Western European Jews and Eastern European Jews. But anyway, Cudahy is observing the particular way in which Eastern European Jews were having a certain difficulty assimilating themselves into the sort of Anglo-Protestant norms of the United States, but of Western Europe in general. And he points to a number of figures like Marx, Freud, etc., who are demonstrating a certain resistance and resentment about a very sort of, let's say, modest and restrained Anglo-Protestant sort of default way of being in the world, and the difficulty of becoming that, of assimilating into that, and the tension between what it means to be an outsider. And this, by the way, Cudahy says in the book and elsewhere that his experience as an Irish Catholic helped him understand the particular difficulty of Eastern European Jews, because he was also an outsider and also from an outside culture, but that this tension creates some amount of ongoing resentment. And what can happen is that these larger populations reject that Anglo-Protestant culture into which they are assimilating, and this can create all sorts of cultural and social upheaval that is manifest in, let's say, like far left politics, things like certain kinds of avant-garde cultural subversion, etc. But nonetheless,
Anarchism.
yeah,
Italians
yeah.
had the anarchism in the 20s, of course.
Correct. All that kind of stuff. But nonetheless, it is incumbent on these new waves to find their way into this kind of Anglo-Protestant way of being. So anyway, it's a very good book that sort of details some of this history and the difficulties around it. And it is extremely difficult. We would be very naive to think that this just happens automatically. It actually happens through a great deal of coercion. And
Yes.
it requires some will on the part of the people coming in. So, for example, Chris, maybe in your case, certainly in my case, I go back and look at the names of my great-great-grandparents, the first names, and they're all sort
When
of
did they
ethnically
come?
coded.
Do you know exactly what era they
Yeah,
arrived?
end of the 19th century into the early 20th century, before World War I.
Got it.
They were mostly all here, but every single one of the second generation all had Anglophone names. Okay. And I know it's sort of trivial. It seems superficial, but look around at the new coming immigrant groups. Which ones of them give their children Anglophone names, American traditional names? Do we even have American traditional names anymore, by the way? Like, sometimes I wonder. So maybe it's not altogether their fault.
East Asians do so at greater rates. And I've noticed in particular, Chinese Americans like to take like a British royal names. So it'll be, Penelope and Victoria, etc.
Yes.
Especially the Chinese groups from Singapore, from Hong Kong, from Shanghai, former, British, colonial territories.
Yeah, look, when I was teaching, it was a lot of like Franks and Henrys and this sort of thing. But it's great. Carry on.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, I think it's good. And
yes, it is good.
It's interesting. So I'll share a bit about my experience. Of course, as half Anglo, I want to teach you in particular about what it means to be an American.
Please.
Our people, the not the Rufos, but the Fergusons and the Passmores, my other side, were quite deeply rooted. So we're going to give a tutorial for the Lomez's. But even into the 20th century, my father came to the United States in 1961 as a young boy, and it's really interesting to hear his stories about arriving in Philadelphia. They had a Catholic parish that was called St. Donato's in South Philly. And it was all people from San Donato, the little town, and then other little towns around it. And there was an Italian neighborhood, there was an Irish neighborhood, there was a Black neighborhood, and then there was a kind of WASP neighborhood. And each of these communities operated as a patchwork. And there were always suspicions, like the Irish kids would make fun of the Italian kids for having like a fried egg sandwich in their lunch. And the Jewish kids, the Black, they were fighting. There were leather jackets. It was like, West Side Story or whatever. But what's really interesting is that even in this kind of the broader community was kind of a heterogeneous community, but even in the homogenous Italian community, there was a real imperative towards assimilation. Yeah. And so the nuns at the Catholic parish, for example, my father arrives from Italy. He's 11 years old, and he remembers like, speaking Italian in school was strictly forbidden. And they would come and they would rap you across the knuckles with a ruler if you were speaking Italian to your friend, in the seat behind you. And there was just a relentless, we're here to be in America. Yeah. We're grateful for this opportunity. We have to assimilate into the general culture. We have to adapt the customs and the norms as far as we can. We can still practice Catholicism. We can still have our Italian festivals. But the home culture becomes almost a ceremonial culture. And then you hope that your subsequent generations become fully American. They had that embedded in their own culture. And then the broader civilization, America as a whole, also pressed that from the outside. And then, fast forward now, all of those ethnic neighborhoods and enclaves have been kind of dispersed. People move to the suburbs, and people kind of move on. They move up, and their children and grandchildren are, fully assimilated Americans, and I think could be considered almost at that point a kind of an ethnic American identity.